All right, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. I guess it's almost good evening. My name is Whitney Roberts. I'm one of the hosts of the Broken Token Classic Arcade and Pinball Podcast. My co-host, compatriot friend Brent Griffiths back in the back. Would you say, Brent? You called it the Peanut Gallery, right? Yes, sir. Yeah. So Peanut Gallery represents. But this session is one that it's a little hard to take everybody through a visual history of Nintendo's arcade legacy without having a bunch of games here to do that in the way that I would really love to do it. So effectively, I have to do it in the next best medium, which is slides. So I always struggle because I don't want to PowerPoint people to death, but ultimately this is a good way to I think get some really good facts across and some points across that even when I was doing the research on this particular topic, I didn't even realize, because I think over time we kind of take some facts for granted, we take some numbers for granted, and we take other things as just kind of common knowledge, which after you start doing some research is really kind of anything but nonetheless, what we're going to do is we're going to use the next hour. We're going to do a fairly quick walkthrough of Nintendo's arcade history. We do have a fair amount to cover, but if anybody has any questions as we go, just feel free to stop. We are going to be focusing on the titles that were developed either directly or indirectly, and we'll get into that here in just a little bit about what how that played out and what that means by Nintendo. So I guess another way of saying that is we're not going to get into the third-party licensed games like R-Type and everything like that. And we're not going to take into account the Play Choice 10 games because in effect, they were really just NES games on a cart that operated on a timer system. And so even though they were in an arcade cabinet, they were never quote unquote, I guess, born of the arcade. And then I hope everybody shows up for the fun of it, and there will be a couple prizes as we go, assuming my slide foo is strong. Okay, whoops, you see in there, it was not. All right, so we'll start this out and test some knowledge. I'm kind of curious about this because I always love to just kind of ping the audience in this and just kind of set a bit of a baseline. So true or false, was Donkey Kong Nintendo's first arcade release? False. Yeah, definitely. And you'd be surprised in talking to people how they think that to be the case. What's interesting is it was actually a game called the Laser Clay Shooting System. And we'll show that here in just a few minutes and what that monstrosity and how big that system actually was and how it operated. But yeah, Nintendo's arcade chops go back decades and decades. Okay, second one here. True or false, Mario Brothers was the first game to feature Mario's brother Luigi. Is that true or false? Come on. Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things that it kind of goads you into saying false, but it is true. It is true. That was the first game where Luigi did show up. And then the next one here, number 3, did Nintendo ever release a Donkey Kong game without Mario? Yeah, most certainly. And there actually wound up being a couple, but from game-wise, being a couple, but from an arcade standpoint, yeah, it was Donkey Kong 3. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Now, just some fun facts before we get into covering each one of the games. If we were to take all the arcade titles and slot them and put them in a category, because as we know in society everything has to have a label, otherwise we don't understand it. So if we take the games and label them, look at these numbers here. If we take the first generation, I've got a slide typo there, I apologize. First generation, the pre-DK games, we're looking at the years of 1973 to 1980. We've actually got 12 titles in that. During DK's heyday, the golden era of arcades, we've got 10 titles, and then post-DK, we've actually got 19 titles, okay? And if we look at that, all up, category, sorry, that was a slide mishap, fat fingers there. But if we were to add all of that up, that's amazing. That's 41 arcade titles that Nintendo released over the course of, quote unquote, their time in the arcade industry, the coin-op arcade industry. So let's take a look at the pre-DK games, and this is the format that this is going to cover. We'll kind of go through these and talk about these here for just a few minutes, and then move on through them. But first up, the mini laser clay system that was built and distributed in 1973, 1974. This system ran off of 16 millimeter film. So it was more of an, I guess if you want to call it or give it another label, is more of an electromechanical type of game. But what's interesting here in 1973, when the system was first released, this system was installed in deserted bowling alleys in Japan. So that's how Nintendo would recoup some of the real estate and some of the development costs, and that the system was so big and so huge that that's the real estate that it took to install and play that game. Of course, you can see it's kind of a I guess a shooting game or target practice game. But in 1974, it did so well during 1973 that the financials were strong enough that Nintendo was able to re-engineer the system a bit, collapse it down, and then you can see games here like Wild Gunman, Shooting Trainer, and things like that came after the laser clay system that fit in a bowling alley, and then ran through the 1973, 1974, 1975 era and things like that. 1978. We had a Nintendo released Computer Othello, and that was probably one of their quote unquote their first cocktail games. And this is just as you would imagine, just Othello. The interesting note about this, though, is that if you've dug into Nintendo's history a bit, back in 1978 is when Nintendo R&D 1, which was responsible for so many of the arcade title releases, was put in or commissioned and put into action at Nintendo, and this was Nintendo R&D 1's first commercial arcade release. And if we look over here, 1978 as well, Block Fever. What we're going to find as we step through the next several slides is that a lot of Nintendo's early arcade games were homages or let's say renditions. I don't want to say rips because they had additional features and differentiating gameplay to some degree, but ultimately the ideas were the same as some of the predecessors in the industry. And Block Fever was much like that. I mean, if you take a look at that, it's very breakout-ish or very breakout-esque. But again, that was one of Nintendo's sit-down cocktail tables for the time. Now, kind of moving on here, we look through 1979. We saw quite a few titles released here. And what do all these titles have in common? What do they kind of look like? Space Invaders. Yeah, that's exactly right. So if we look over here at the very left, 1979 Space Fever. That was Nintendo's, we'll say, take on Space Invaders with some differentiating gameplay. They had the blocks of aliens or the Space Invaders broken up into two groups. And then we move over here to 1979 with Space Fever High Splitter, which was kind of a spiritual successor to Space Fever. It was color, and it was interesting because the aliens were double wide in this version of the game, and depending upon where you would hit them, they would either dissolve and disappear as normal, or they would split into two and then continue on. So again, like differing game mechanics, but still riding on the theme of the day. And I'm kind of curious, has anyone here in the room played Space Launcher by any chance? This is, although it looks like a Space Invaders clone, it really is not. This is a very, very unique game. This game is a ton of fun. The goal here in Space Launcher is to navigate your ship up the screen and avoid the aliens and the targets that they're shooting, or the targets I guess the missiles and the bombs and everything that they're shooting down at you, that they're targeting at you. And the goal is to dock your ship up into one of the 4 space docks right here, and depending upon the point value that you want, it'll be more difficult to get into the dock. And then after you dock, then you have to land your ship. You have to reverse it and then land your ship back down on the pad. And it is a lot of fun. Very, very unique and good mechanics. All right, so just kind of moving through here, and I did moving through the later 1970s. I did include a couple of cabinet pictures because I did want to feature some of the art where possible. Some of the previous games, like Space Fever and Space Fever High Splitter and things like that, a lot of them were either offered only in a cocktail, or if it was an upright, it saw such limited release that it never made it over to America. So a lot of the artwork, if you were in Brent's session, an hour ago, talking about the artwork helping the game, Nintendo really didn't get into that mantra until the release of Sheriff in 1979. And I know it might be a little hard to see, but if you take a look at Sheriff from a gameplay mechanic, this was one of the first games to feature a human protagonist, an actual person in the game. And if you look at the bottom picture there, look at the beauty of that cabinet. It's all wood panel. It's very tall. It's very wide. It's got a great stance to it. Just a very beautiful game. And then there's one of the trimline versions of Sheriff as well, and that's actually from my friend Alex's personal collection. I had to ask him for that picture because there's just not a lot of pictures of Sheriff, honestly, to go around. And then move over here to the middle, Monkey Magic in 1979. This was a very interesting game in the simple fact that you were playing as a character that was trying to, quote unquote, break a monkey's face. It was a breakout style game, but the game had 4 levels in it, all played on the same playing field, that depending upon how you progressed through the blocks here, the screen would kind of wipe over to the next level, and you would take out the bottom of the monkey's face, take out the eyes, take out the mouth and the face and everything like that. Very, very interesting game, but not really I don't think a lot of high interest from a public standpoint. But look at the artwork on the cabinet. It's such a beautiful, beautiful cabinet, and it's just not one that we see very often at all. As far as I know, this never had Monkey Magic never had a United States release, and this is a very, very, very rare Nintendo game. In fact, I want to say earlier this year, saw one sell on Yahoo Auctions Japan, and it sold for right around the $3,500 mark, and that was a non-working Monkey Magic. So very, very, very high dollar. Oops, I'm sorry. And then 1979, Head On. So Brent, this is a direct interpretation of one of the Exidy games that you're talking about in your session. So Nintendo took a theme, built their own version of it, and of course this game is you're running your car through a maze, collecting the dots, and you can shift lanes at any of the intersections. And if you've ever played Dodge 'em on the 2600, this is exactly what you're playing. So interesting how Nintendo was doing that. And one thing I did want to mention, Head On. This is a licensed game from Sega. So even though it was released under the quote the Nintendo banner, it was actually developed by Sega and licensed and released. And as far as I know, I think that is the first one, only released in Japan as well. And then kind of wrapping up the pre-Donkey Kong games, there is a radar scope out on the game floor here today to play, and I would encourage everybody, if you haven't played it before, to give it a shot. This game was released in Japan, had some fairly moderate success to it, but by the time that it came over to the United States, Nintendo of America, NOA, was just really getting up and running, and they had placed orders for radar scopes, and it took so long to ship them from Japan to the United States that by the time that NOA had the games and were ready to distribute them and get them on location, the game just its time had passed. It just really wasn't marketable. And then from that standpoint, Donkey Kong was born. And then I think everybody knows the history from that, how how those early radar scopes were converted over into Donkey Kong. But in 1980, we also saw Space Firebird and Hellfire. What's interesting about Space Firebird is that this is a bit of a take on Galaga, a 1980 take on the Galaga and Galaxian theme. It is a very fun game. It's got some really neat enemy mechanics as how they swoop in and swoop out and get larger and smaller. And it gives you a real nice kind of periscope look at the playfield. And then Hellfire is an interesting game in and of its own right. It's a lot like Space Invaders, except you're a submarine and you're shooting helicopters and you're just trying to dodge either fish or shark. Okay, so it's a pretty rare game. I've seen a few of these here in the United States, but you just really don't see a lot of these games, even Radar Scope inclusive, because the distribution channel here in the U.S. just hadn't really spun up and wasn't really all that all that efficient at that point in time. So if we look at DK's heyday, okay, in the games that were I guess released in that golden era of arcades, of course everybody knows Donkey Kong, but just real quick, I mean, I think it is pretty amazing to go back and think about even just the games that we have already covered. Yet if you were to go out and ask probably 100 people, it's like name the first Nintendo arcade game, I'd say probably 90 out of the 100 would say Donkey Kong, because it's a mindset perspective and a mindshare perspective. But look at all the games that we've covered just leading up to that. So Donkey Kong had quite a runway before it was released. But of course, won't belabor the point. Probably Nintendo's most successful arcade game, definitely the birth of one of their most successful franchises. I'd say even to some degree, society pervasive type of franchises. I mean, Mario, the whole Mario franchise is just it's legendary from that regard. But when we look at Donkey Kong, it was really a game of a bit of mishap, because Shigeru Miyamoto was the designer of the game. It was developed by Nintendo R&D 1. This was a game that came about after two things happened. After Radar Scope was a flop, and then number two, after Nintendo could not secure the license to Popeye in time. So if you think about it, Donkey Kong really only happened because two other things fell through. And two other things that Nintendo, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but if you look at history, try to take a retrospective on that. If we look at the timing of history, had either of those two items or either of those two events played out as intended, then Donkey Kong probably would not even exist, at least not the way that we know it. Moving on here, 1981, Sky Skipper was originally envisioned from a thematic perspective to be the successor to Donkey Kong. It does have the Donkey Kong, or a form of the Donkey Kong sprites in it. This game is also out on the expo floor. I encourage you to play it. It will be a bit hard to find to play anywhere else. I mean, the game was never released here in the United States. Documentation is always a bit spotty on the internet. According to our sources, it was also not released in Japan due to just essentially play testing, and it never play tested well. And so, especially over here in the United States, and Nintendo of America pulled the plug on it after the play testing was not sufficient for profitability standards, and essentially Nintendo shelved this game after it was completely done, after it was completely developed and ready to go to market, and they put it in the archives and essentially mothballed the entire game. So Sky Skipper is a very interesting piece in Nintendo history, because it made it right up to the doorstep, and then the door was closed, and then they just put it back in the archives and went on. Space Demon, also 1981, as you can see here. a bit of the space shooter variant as well. The ship's a bit larger. It does incorporate some pretty interesting movement mechanics of the aliens and everything like that. But again, just another take on on the space shooter genre. This was or is regarded as a successor to Space Firebird as well. So, I think a lot of the space games here that Nintendo did, they mixed it up pretty good, considering it was a bit of a trope by the time the early '80s had rolled around. 1982 and 1983 saw, I think, probably some of the most popular, of course, with Donkey Kong as well, 1981. But 1982, 1983, getting into 1984, saw probably some of the most popular arcade games that Nintendo ever released. Of course, in 1982 we have Donkey Kong Jr. as a successor. This game's interesting in the sheer fact that it takes the theme and flips it, whereas Mario is now the bad guy. Donkey Kong is seen as the person under persecution, and it's up to Junior to save Papa. 1982. It's kind of interesting what a difference a year makes, because by 1982, Nintendo had worked out the licensing for Popeye, and then the game was finished in development and then gone ahead and released. What's also interesting, though, about Popeye is I was doing some research on this. The original design of Popeye had some game mechanics that were quite honestly just too advanced for the hardware at the time. There's actually going to be a motion where there was a catapult motion where Popeye Brutus would have been flown across the screen. And for 1981 and 1982, from a design perspective, that was desired, but from a hardware perspective, it just couldn't be pulled off. So of course, there's always concessions, and what we have is, or what we got is what you see today. But what's interesting is if you kind of step your way back, isn't it neat to see how the sprites and the colors and the art of the game is getting more and more detailed as the time goes on? I mean, if you think back to 1980 and you look at something like Hellfire, or if you look at something like Space Firebird or something like that, even Sheriff and so on. I mean, very simplistic gameplay, very simplistic sprites, but even just through the course of a couple of years, I mean, the advancements are just unbelievable.
Yeah, Whitney. Yeah. We just got news that if you're parked out on Adkins, they're going to start towing cars. So if anyone in here is parked out there, just want to let everybody know. Guess not? All right, cool.
Yeah, all right. Party on.
Got it.
All right, good deal. Thank you. And then 1983, with the sheer success of the Mario franchise really kicking off, we see Mario Brothers. And again, as we stated earlier, this is a game that introduced Mario's brother Luigi to the gameplay mechanic, and this was also Nintendo's first entry into cooperative arcade gameplay using this theme. And this game was moderately successful, but certainly not as successful as Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr., but still a financial success in its own right. But this game and the mechanics of this really paved the way for the Versus system that we'll talk about just here in a few minutes. Now, just kind of wrapping up through Donkey Kong's heyday, we have Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out. And what's interesting about these two games is that these games, and the reason the screen is so much bigger is from a form factor perspective, these two games had two monitors in them, one stacked on top of the other, where the monitor on the bottom was the play field, and the monitor on the top was the gameplay statistics, the stats. So it's interesting because Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out were released, as you can see, within the same year, and they were definitely financial successes. But from a gameplay perspective, Super Punch-Out introduced an additional gameplay mechanic with a 5-way joystick, and also some new fighters and some new characters to take on. But the games were largely very, 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 very similar to each other. It's not one that you see very often. It's definitely a very valuable game in today's market as well. And then kind of rounding this out with 1984 with Donkey Kong 3. What's interesting about this game is that it was it was designed. It was designed, I think, with the franchise in mind, but trying to appeal to a larger audience. And if you look at this, it's interesting. I think the choices that Nintendo took with this, because even though it's a Donkey Kong game, it doesn't feature Mario. It features a character named Stanley. The gameplay mechanics are not really platform based. This is kind of a shooter, and in a lot of ways, it's more of the same kind of Galaga-esque type of mechanics. This game, Donkey Kong 3, was not really well received in the market. One of the interesting points about it was never offered in a dedicated cabinet form either. It was only available as a conversion kit that operators would buy and then take a Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr. or Mario or potentially Mario Brothers, whatever it may be, Popeye, whatever, and then convert it over with the kit after those games had kind of eclipsed their earning potential. And then here at the very end of Donkey Kong's heyday, I can almost guarantee you that this is a game that you probably have not seen. Just out of curiosity, has anybody ever even heard of arm wrestling before? Oh, wow, excellent. Okay, has anybody? Okay, I see about half and half. So, okay, that's impressive. Has anybody played in arm wrestling before? Two? Oh, okay, all right, cool. Did you like the game? Was it good? Was it fun? Was?
Yeah, I own one. So.
You own one.
Yeah.
Even better. Okay, well, you've probably got the prize of the room then, because as you know, I mean, the value on these has skyrocketed over the past, I don't know, 3-5 years, something like that. I mean, they're incredibly rare, and this title was released at what I would consider to be kind of the end of Nintendo's the end of Nintendo's arcade development run, so to speak. And it shares the same form factor as Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out, 2 monitors, but it's definitely a very unique game. I mean, I've seen just the board sets alone, eclipse $1,000. It's unbelievable how the money has just completely run up on this game. All right. So what's interesting about, or one of the interesting facts about some of the research that I'd done is kind of rolling through this presentation, is when we look at all of the games that we just covered, both from the pre-DK era, at the end of the pre-DK era, especially through the DK era, from a design and a development standpoint, 2 names consistently keep coming up in Nintendo's history. A gentleman by the name of Jinyo Takeda and then Shigeru Miyamoto. These 2 gentlemen were these 2 gentlemen were each responsible or co-responsible for developing almost everything from Nintendo's arcade legacy that we've talked about today, especially from the Sheriff lineage on forward. Okay, so these 2 gentlemen really set into motion so much of what we have today. Jinyo Takeda did a lot of hardware development for Nintendo, worked at Nintendo for 45 years before he retired. Very prolific on the hardware design side. He was responsible, one of the primary development leads for the Famicom system, which later became, over here in the United States, the NES. Did some work on the Super Nintendo platform and developed a lot of the sports titles. Which I thought was actually pretty interesting, especially the sports titles for an American release. And then, of course, Shigeru Miyamoto created the Donkey Kong franchise, the Donkey Kong, the Mario franchise, did a lot of the artwork for the earlier games, Sheriff, Sky Skipper, Donkey Kong 3, Popeye, things like that. So if I look at this, I mean, these 2 gentlemen really carried almost all of the water for Nintendo's arcade ambitions during the years. And from a franchise standpoint, we roll this forward. Of course, Mario, Donkey Kong, also Super Mario, the Super Mario Brother franchise, and everything like that. There's one other franchise that Miyamoto is directly responsible for that doesn't really fit into this presentation, but I'm kind of curious. Does anybody know what that is? You're so close. Keep going. You're almost there.
It's in there somewhere.
It is. It's all of Legend of Zelda. It's all of Legend of Zelda. So I'll tell you what. You got close enough. This is yours. You get the prize. That's one of them anyway. So yes, we got the Super Mario Brothers Encyclopedia. Anybody that listens to the podcast knows that I'm a sucker for a hardback book, and so I collect them and love to read them at night and stuff like that. So we add to that, the Legend of Zelda. So this man's resume is unparalleled in the video game world, completely unparalleled. Okay, moving forward. Just before we get into the Versus system and kind of roll through the games there, I do want to just kind of set a bit of a frame for this. The Versus system is a very, very unique system. Does anybody here happen to have a Versus system by any chance? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, we've got a couple. I do as well. It's a very neat system, and I think that it reflects Nintendo's ingenuity, because they were taking some of the success from the console side and backporting it into the arcade. Well, let's take a look at this. It was the Versus system was released to market in the 1984-ish time frame, and that led right up to the crash of the mid-'80s, the industry crash of the mid-'80s. It was implemented, and I'm not saying it's responsible for it. I'm saying that in no way, shape, or form. It was released, the timing was coincidental such that the crash happened right after the release of the Versus system. And even though it has a pretty prolific library, it's pretty easy to see that the industry as a whole was getting a bit tired. It was getting a bit long in the tooth, and I don't think that this platform really had its proper due. There was so much more that it could have done. It was implemented as an arcade platform designed to run NES quality, and say that in quotes, NES quality games, because if you think about it, at the time, when the NES came out, it was groundbreaking, because the NES actually had better graphics, or at least on par graphics, as most any other arcade game of the day. Yet it was at your house, and you could buy it in a box, take it home, and play it, and you were playing literally arcade quality games on your TV. So Nintendo's goal with this was to take some of the titles that were seeing very, very good commercial success on the NES side, and then backport them over into the arcade. And then they would add some additional capabilities along the way. One of the big things is allowing players to compete with each other in real time, and we'll show the mechanics of that just here in a minute. It came in 3 different cabinet types. There was the table, the Versus table, which is commonly called a red tent, which is this right here. It has 2 monitors in it, and the players each face their own monitor and play the same game or different games depending upon how it's configured. The Versus Unisystem is the Versus system just in a regular Nintendo cabinet, like a Donkey Kong cabinet. Standard upright. It had a control panel that allowed for 2 people to play at the same time. And then the Versus Dual System, which you probably don't see very often, is this cabinet right here. And that was actually a double wide arcade cabinet with 2 monitors that were angled a little bit to allow 2 people to play at the same time, to get that alternating or competing perspective without having to sit down, or without bleeding over on each other, or without forcing 2 people to look at the same screen and try to play their portion of the game on one screen. So the Versus system was pretty unique in the way that it implemented its gameplay mechanics. Oh, and I'm sorry, just real quick, it did have 2 launch titles, Versus Baseball and Versus Tennis, and let's take a look at those here real quick, just from a notability standpoint. If you take a look at the screen caps here, what was really innovative at the time about the Versus system is that if you take a look at like Versus Tennis, for example, depending upon which player you are, the white or the blue, you're looking at the game from your perspective, and it takes place from your perspective. So what happens on your screen also happens on the other player's screen, just from the alternating perspective. versus baseball. Very easy to see how that plays out. Depending upon if you're the home team or the visitor team, if you're in the field or if you're up at bat, your perspective is completely different. From a camera perspective, you're either behind home plate or the camera is behind the field looking down to home plate. So again, those are the two launch titles, and then versus Othello. Not necessarily one that I would have immediately thought that there would be any amount of commercial success for. I mean, nothing against Othello, but it is Othello. It's just kind of tough to say how are you going to push that to a high degree of financial success there. But nonetheless, those are some of the early titles for the Versus system. And it's interesting. We look at this we look at some of the games here. I'll kind of start over here at the right and then work my way back to the left. Of course, this is all 1984, so you can see this is kind of a rapid-fire release cycle by Nintendo. We have Versus Golf and Versus Ladies Golf, which were direct ports from the NES game back to the Versus system. And the only difference being between the avatar playing, and that's a very Mario-esque looking avatar. And you'll notice Nintendo does that a lot inside their games where they can. And versus Ladies Golf, it just swaps the avatar out, but otherwise the gameplay is completely the same. But sports games, for whatever reason, did well for Nintendo from a commercial success standpoint. I think a lot of it had to do with the ease of gameplay, the way that they simplified the mechanics and everything like that. And it's interesting because if we were to just take a step back here real quick, I don't know. Whoops, sorry about that. Wrong way. Go back. Versus baseball and versus tennis. If you have either of those games for your Versus system, I mean, they hold up really well today. They're fun to play. Like I say, they're very simplistic, and especially with two people, they're challenging and fun, and the music is always good, and the animation's good, and I'll tell you, they've got legs where a lot of other sports games do not. Versus pinball, this is a pretty interesting game. It's a scrolling game. It's a little bit different from the NES game in that regard. On the arcade side, it does scroll and move. It's interesting as well because Mario and Pauline are also in this game, and it's a type of like pinball rescue game, if you want to call it of anything. But yeah, that's also one of the release titles for the Versus system as well. And then just kind of working through the library here real quick. We've got Versus Wrecking Crew. This is probably considered the Mario game that nobody remembers because this game does have Mario and Luigi in it. It's interesting in the fact that Donkey Kong's not there, and a lot of the other characters from Pauline's not there. A lot of the other characters from the theme aren't there, but this is a bit of a platformer in that you're trying to go through this construction site and demolish the doors on the construction site. It's interesting because you have to have a bit of strategy because your ability to move through the playfield is dependent upon the actions that both you and your opponent take. So it's a very fun game, very challenging, but it's just definitely not very popular, I think. And like I say, I think it's one that most people definitely forget about. Versus Balloon Fight, that's a 1984 game as well. Has anybody played this by any chance? Yeah. Do you like it? I see, and that's what I was going to say. It's probably one of the best games. Probably one of the best games for the system all up. It's got a great mechanic. The way that it scrolls for the players, it's just a very, very neat game. And real quick, I think I wanted to make sure that I noticed. Yeah, I did have this down. Versus Balloon Fight was unique because it was the only Versus title that released on the Versus platform and then made its way to the NES. Everything else was the other way around. But it's definitely a fun game. Some of the music's a bit different based upon whether they're playing the NES or the arcade version. Some of the gameplay mechanics are a little bit different. Some of the characters and the levels are a bit different, but ultimately it's a very, very fun game. Versus Clu Clu Land, 1984. This is a very interesting game in the sense it's a bit of a maze game, but the gameplay mechanics have you swinging around the posts and kind of building a kind of a door system as you go through the level, and as you complete the level, it draws out a bit of a picture. But the interesting thing about this game is that it was named by mistake, because I want to make sure that I get this right. If I look down through this, from a name perspective, its Japanese name is Kuru Kuru Rando. And so with Kuru Kuru meaning spinning around and then randomly, it was renamed differently for the U.S. market, but it's definitely a different game. I myself don't really get a whole lot of enjoyment out of it, but I don't know. Has anybody played it on the NES by any chance, or did you play it on the Versus system, or is this one that you visit a lot? Do you find it to be high replay value? Yeah, I see somebody shaking his head no, and it's like, yeah, it's cool.
But I think Nintendo, I don't think Clu Clu Land.
Yeah. See, and that's the same thing for me. But in some of these titles are interesting because some of them are very thematically Nintendo, and then some of them are very not. And it's like, okay, I'm kind of curious as to what was going on from a design perspective. But I have to give them credit for originality, for sure. And then here's a few more. 1984, getting into 1985, we've got Versus Excitebike. I think Excitebike's probably one of the more challenging games on the Versus system. It's definitely probably one of the more misunderstood. From a goaling perspective, your entire mission in life is to keep your bike engine, keep the engine temperature of the bike cool, and to move through the course as quickly as possible. And even though it is on the quote unquote the Versus system, it is only a one-player game. It's not a two-player game or anything like that. So it's kind of interesting from that regard. The NES game plays very, very close to it. The arcade version has got expanded tracks, and I think the mechanic translates better for the Versus system. But it's a great game, and I think it's probably one of the more unsung heroes of the platform. Now, this next one, Versus Urban Champion, is interesting because I have, in doing the research for this, I found some conflicting reports around whether or not the ROMs for this game were ever released, were ever made available, were ever quote unquote found. But this game, for I'd say the longest part of its history, was often considered the unobtainium Versus game, simply because it was from an arcade perspective, the ROMs were quote unquote never released. But when we look at the game, it's probably one of Nintendo's first platform, I guess, kind of fighter games. It's interesting in the fact that from a mechanic perspective, about the only thing that you do is throw punches and just try to knock your opponent off the screen. And as you move them across from screen to screen to screen, moving through the levels, then eventually you knock them into knock your opponent into an open manhole, and then that's the game. But has anybody played this on the NES by any chance? And I mean, have you any opinion of it? I mean, I decided to revisit it, and it did not age well at all. Yeah, exactly. It did not age good at all. Okay, and then here in 1985, we've also got Versus Ice Climber. This is a fantastic game because the characters that were introduced here also made an appearance in the Super Smash Brothers line. So they've got some great lineage to them. The NES game, for the number of levels that it had, I want to say 32, and then the arcade version, I think, added on an additional 16 levels on top of that, if I've got my facts straight. And this is a great game. I think this is probably one of the more fun games on the system. It's got a lot of variety. I think the music's good. But it's one that also I think from talking to people, they tend to have it as a favorite as well. Has anybody played this by any chance? You like it? Yeah, it is. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, so that's versus Ice Climber in 1985. As you can see, we've got a lot of releases in a short number of years. I mean, they just keep rolling, almost like they're kind of cranked out assembly line style. Versus Hogan's Alley and versus Duck Hunt are light gun games that were ported back from the NES onto the Versus system. Hogan's Alley is just essentially a target practice game with a bit of mode difference between the NES and the arcade version, based around the way that you play either game A or game B. And on the arcade, they're essentially stacked back to back with each other. The interesting thing about Duck Hunt from the Versus standpoint is that it actually includes a third mode from a target perspective, and on the arcade version, you can shoot the dog. And so it's kind of, I guess, an interesting point from that regard. But I don't know. I go back and revisit them. Versus Hogan's Alley is not a whole lot of fun at all. It's just kind of a twitch shooter, and that's that. Duck Hunt's fun. I mean, it's definitely got its following, and it translates well. Another one that I've gone back and tried to I guess see how it ages is versus Mach Rider. And I don't think that's really aged well at all either. I mean, you're riding a motorcycle with machine guns on it, and it's kind of, I guess, kind of a cross between Spy Hunter and pole position on a motorcycle. But from the arcade perspective, it was essentially a direct port of the NES version. One thing that's interesting, I did not realize this, I found in some of the research that I was doing, is that in the arcade version, as you complete a level, it would uncover a tile off of a picture, and then after you made it through all the levels, it just revealed that the main character was female. And so I guess that was pretty progressive, or pretty, I don't know, pretty maybe scandalous at the time. I don't know. But the NES version definitely did not do that, but the arcade version does. And then kind of rounding this out, we just got a couple more to go. Versus Soccer is soccer. It's definitely fun with people, especially if you've got two or more players, 4 players especially. It's a great game. I think it actually ages and plays well just based upon the mechanics of it. And then of course I think what most would probably consider the standard for the Versus system, Super Mario Brothers. Of course, developed and released on the NES, and then backported for the arcade version. The arcade version is definitely a lot harder. As you move along, some of the levels are just altogether different. The warp zones are different, things like that. Some of the levels towards the end of the game just are not in the NES version whatsoever. But anytime I think of the Versus system, I automatically think of Super Mario Brothers. And then Versus Gumshoe, and then we got one more after this, but Versus Gumshoe, this is another light gun game. It's got a bit of a weird mechanic. You shoot your character to make him jump and float, and it's kind of odd in the fact that the game just scrolls to the right. You're a detective trying to save your daughter, but from a gameplay mechanics perspective, it's just hard to play, because you play the game with the light gun and just kind of shoot your character along, collect the balloons, and move along through the game. Has anybody played this by chance? Because I've revisited it, and it was, again, it just did not age well. I mean, literally 45 seconds, and I was done with it. And it's like, this just isn't as fun as I thought it would be. You know, some games are great, some are just not really all that grand. And then here, last but certainly not least, we give you Dr. Mario. This is probably one, in my mind, this is probably one of the greater games for the Versus system. It's definitely a ton of fun. The music is good. It's a great 2-player game in the sense that it's very Tetris-esque in the gameplay mechanics, but it's just good. I find myself smiling the entire time that I'm playing it. I love the music. I love the tempo of it. And you can tell that it's Nintendo. It's just got that feel to it. But yeah, the goal of the game is much like in Tetris. You can think about it like that from a goal perspective, is lining up the pills and then destroying the viruses and everything like that without allowing the bottles to fall up. But yeah, definitely a great competitive game for sure. And then with that, I would say that's it. I don't know how my time ran. I'm a little bit over, aren't I? Sorry about that. Yeah, my bad. But yeah, like I say, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But yeah, thank you everybody for attending. I'd say go out on the expo floor, get a chance to play Skyscraper and play Radar Scope. Two very rare and unique Nintendo games that just don't show up all that often. And yeah, I'd say play as many of the Nintendo titles that you can find. I mean, I don't know that I don't think there's anything rarer than Skyscraper and Radar Scope out there on the floor. But hopefully some of this gives you some insight into everything that surrounds the Donkey Kong, the Donkey Kong mindset, so to speak. And it just gives you some insight into just so much more that Nintendo has done. But yeah, that's me. I'm Whitney at BrokenToken.com. Brent, my co-host, at Brent at BrokenToken.com. And this is our social media links. And Brent, I changed this up because I recently put us back on AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, and I revived our MySpace page. Okay. Yeah, no, I do not have the password. It's saved in my browser. If my computer crashes, it's done. So that's it. So yeah. So thanks everybody for attending. I mean, if anybody's got any questions, certainly, or just like to talk about the games, I'm a huge fan of Nintendo's work in the arcades. I mean, it's almost become a second obsession, so to speak, for me. And I just love Nintendo's history when it comes to this part of their business. So would certainly never turn anybody away if they wanted to talk. But I mean, any questions or comments? Would love to hear them. Thank you. Yes, sir.
How did you get additional games for the Versus system? Were they ROMs?
Yeah. They came in a ROM pack, and it was essentially a long white box that I'm going to say was maybe what, Brent, 2 feet long, something like that, 18 inches long, 18 inches, 2 feet long, and it was a hard plastic case, black case, and you'd flip it open, and it would have a marquee, and it would have an instruction card, and then would have the game ROMs. What made the Versus system so interesting is the PCBs that ran in that system would house two games. There was like a left side and a right side, or an A side and a B side. And for the competitive games like tennis or baseball, you would install the same game on both sides so that player one would play the same game that player two would play. And it was just a ROM swap. And then if you wanted to offer up, let's say like on the red tent, like on the tabletop version, or the cocktail version, the table version, you could put you could install the ROMs for Super Mario Brother on one side of the PCB, and install, let's say, like Clu Clu Land on the other side of the PCB, and then two people could sit at the table and play completely separate games if they wanted to. So it's a very modular system when it comes to that. Yes, sir.
Follow up on that. How many 4-player games did they put out for that?
Good question. I think Soccer and baseball may be the only two that I'm aware of. Was tennis? Could you do tennis?
Tennis was balloon fight. Yeah.
Balloon fight would do four. Would it do? I've never played it that way.
4-player. Balloon fight, I believe it can be 4. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've never played balloon fight in 4 players, so I was not aware of that. So I'd say probably the number's small.
I've never played the 4-player either, but I thought if you had on both sides.
On both sides, you could do that. Yeah, it makes me want to try it out now because I'm kind of curious as to how it handles the scrolling mechanic for everybody. I'm sure that it probably bounds 1 and 2 to one screen and 3 to 4 to the other screen. I know that if you're playing it just 2-player, it'll scroll independently, and you can move your way through the game irregardless of the other person playing. So that's cool from that regard. But I've never tried it 4-player. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Which game do you think, Nintendo game, pushed the boundaries the most of the tech at the time, as far as like graphics and art?
Good.
Made the most of
Made the most of the tech at the time. That's a very good question. I would have to say, from a complexity standpoint, it has to be the Versus system, just from sheer complexity and utility. Okay, but from an ingenuity perspective, I think it was probably like Punch Out and Super Punch Out, simply because of the way that they had one board that would drive 2 monitors and split the gameplay across 2 monitors. I think ingenuity and tech-wise, it's probably going to be a toss-up between those two. But from an art perspective, honestly, it's going to be the art that Miyamoto did. So when you look at like Sky Skipper or Donkey Kong 3. I mean, those you look at those and those have got the soul of Nintendo in that art, and I don't know. So yeah, it's completely different based upon the topic, at least for me. Yeah. Yeah, good question though. Thank you. All right, anybody else? That's it. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Sorry to hold you over.